My name is Robin Owens. If you don't know me, I am a singer-songwriter, and today we're going to be talking about how in March of 2020, I had COVID. Before we get started with the story, there are a few things I want to say. The first of all is that I am including timestamps because this is a very long story and I'm including everything I think is relevant, and because I'm making this primarily for me to look back on and of course to educate and entertain. But there are timestamps if you want to skip around in the story, skip some of the background, skip to when symptoms started, etc., etc. I do have 3 quick disclaimers I want to give first. I know it's tempting to skip them, but I promise that they're all important and relevant. The first disclaimer is that I am not a medical professional. This is just my experience, this is my story, and if you are having any symptoms or any concerns, you should seek medical attention from a professional. Second, I want to say that I was at the time following all recommendations from the CDC and my local government, and they were different than they are now, and so you should follow the most up-to-date recommendations. For example, at the time, we were not told to wear masks. Now, obviously, that has become a part of our everyday lives. So you should follow the current CDC guidelines, not necessarily what I was doing at the time. I am now, of course, following up-to-date guidelines. I got COVID before I had the chance to be careful. Please take the steps that you can to prevent that from happening to you. I never got the chance to wear a mask. I never got a chance to stay home and socially distance. I caught it before I could avoid it. You have the chance to avoid it. Please do that. Third, I want to acknowledge that I did go through COVID with a fair amount of privilege, and I think that's important in these stories to recognize where disparities may lie. So the first one is financial privilege. I do have the financial privilege of being able to seek medical attention and get medication without fear of how I'm going to afford it, because I have parents with good health insurance that I can mooch off of because I'm still 23. I also have to acknowledge how my white privilege played into this. That does unfortunately play a part in all medicine, but especially COVID, because it is infecting and killing Black people and people of color at a significantly higher rate than it is white people, and I want to acknowledge that privilege. There is more information about that linked down below. I do, however, have pre-existing conditions. I have multiple chronic illnesses, and I did have a history of having pneumonia twice within a year when I was in high school. So I did go into this with a pretty weak immune system. I already have a very hard time fighting off infections and recovering, so I knew that I was at a higher risk for catching it and for having complications if I did. Okay, so this is me halfway through the video coming back to give you this disclaimer. If I sound strained or strange talking, it's because I do have long haul symptoms, and so talking for long periods of time is hard for me, but because I'm having a good lung day, I'm just gonna do this all in one go. So if it sounds like I'm having trouble, that's why. That is also why I did choose to wear my microphone today. So hopefully it's okay. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's get into it. To set the stage, this was back in March 2020 when I was still at school in Boston at Berklee College of Music. I was a senior, it was my last semester. The big thing that I worried about first was my spring break trip to Nashville getting canceled. I was looking forward to it and I knew that it was a big possibility. It was an industry trip run by my school. To be honest, I was mostly worried that we wouldn't cancel my flight in time or move it or whatever. After the trip was canceled, it was pretty quickly announced that we would be doing online learning after spring break, which was pretty disappointing because it was my last semester and because I was a TA for a class and I was really enjoying a lot of my classes specifically because of the community of it, which is pretty hard to translate into online learning. So the 13th was the last day where we had in-person learning. I had one class that Friday in the morning and I was pretty emotional about it because I knew that it was probably going to be my last in-person class of my last semester of college. I think I knew even then that even though they said we might return to in-person learning, that it was pretty unlikely considering all of the news that was coming out. The only other thing that I did that Friday was go to a bookstore with one of my friends. We thought that since now no one could do anything or go anywhere for spring break, we might as well buy some books to read since we would be stuck at home. The week of spring break was pretty uneventful. I only left my apartment to get groceries because I usually get them delivered when I lived in Boston because I have trouble carrying heavy things due to chronic illness. So I usually get them delivered, but with the pandemic, everybody was using grocery delivery. So I ended up having to go get them. The only other place that I went during spring break was down the street to a local bakery that sold pastries and like hot chocolate, and that was just to support them. I think I only went once. So Saturday, March 21st, that's the first day when I started showing symptoms. It was a long time ago, so I'm going off of text message records and my memory. The symptoms I was having were that my chest was really tight and I was having a bit of trouble breathing because of that. Not enough that I was really concerned, but more just it was noticeable. I drank a lot of tea because it would loosen up my chest and it would make it easier to breathe. And I just remember drinking the tea, the warmth wearing off, and immediately feeling it and having to make another cup and repeat the process. So I spent the whole day drinking tea, watching Grey's Anatomy for the umpteenth time, and lying down because that made it easier and it didn't hurt as much. So on Sunday, my symptoms continued and it progressed a little bit. So I still had the tightness in my chest. I still had a little bit of trouble breathing. I was coughing a lot. It was a non-productive cough. I had a very low fever and I was really tired and fatigued and I was dizzy. I continued to lie on the couch and drink tea, but at this point I was just miserable. I was at that point, you might know, of sickness where you just don't even care if you're doing anything, you're that sick. It's like, you know, you're really sick when you don't get bored. I only know this because I texted my dad about it. I did take a Dayquil that day and it did make me feel better, but not a lot. Enough that I could move around a little bit, but I had to keep drinking the tea. So on Monday, March 23rd, classes started up again. I hit 3 classes. They were all done virtually, and I had a really hard time participating because I was just so exhausted and I was having so much trouble breathing if I tried to talk, and I was coughing. I remember having to get up to go search for my binder for my conducting class and being just out of breath, dizzy, so exhausted at the end of it that I just had to sit down. It was a time. One of my classes was one-on-one. It was a directed study, and he had commented that I looked really sick and that I should go to a doctor. And he was not wrong. I was very sick. My parents and I decided that I did need to go to a doctor, but I didn't have a primary care physician in Boston, and you can't do telemedicine across state lines. At least you couldn't at the time. Maybe you can now. So we decided that I would go to a telemedicine doctor through an app that did a local Boston doctor. Today is when things really start to happen. So at 9 that morning, I had my appointment with my telemedicine doctor, and he basically said that because I didn't have a fever, my symptoms weren't really bad, and because I didn't have confirmed exposure to someone, he couldn't send me to go get tested because of the shortage of kits, but that he suspected I probably did have it, and that ideally I would go see an urgent care doctor. So I talked to my parents, and we came to the conclusion that I should probably just go ahead and go to urgent care. The concern was, even if this wasn't COVID, my symptoms were pretty concerning, and I was worried that I had pneumonia again. There was only one urgent care center near me that wasn't really sketchy, so I called them to ask if I could come in, and they told me that they weren't seeing anyone with COVID symptoms, which was really annoying because the city of Boston was telling people at the time to go to urgent care so that they wouldn't overwhelm the hospitals, but then urgent care wasn't accepting anyone with COVID symptoms, so I wasn't really sure where that miscommunication happened. Pretty annoying. So next I called a local hospital, and I'm not going to name them because my experience with them in this situation wasn't great, but I did have a lot of really good experiences with them in the past, including at the emergency room when I got a concussion, so I don't want to throw them under the bus. So I called their central line, and they sent me to the COVID line, which ended up actually being their employee testing line, so they couldn't help me, but the woman was really nice and gave me the questionnaire anyway to help me decide whether or not I needed to go get tested, even though I couldn't really go get tested in the way that everyone was told to, because they were telling everyone to go to drive-through testing centers. And as a college student in the city of Boston, in downtown Boston, I didn't have a car or access to one. So she was really nice and really patient, and basically told me that she couldn't get me tested because I wasn't an employee, but that I was always able to go into the hospital and get seen, and that I just had to call ahead to the ER. Something I want to note here that I think is kind of glossed over is the difficulty of communicating symptoms when you have chronic illness. A lot of the symptoms of COVID that aren't similar to a cold, like fatigue, muscle weakness and soreness, the gastrointestinal issues, are things that people with chronic illness just experience on a day-to-day basis. So when people would ask me if I felt fatigued, I would say yes, but I feel fatigued all day, every day. They'd ask if I had muscle pain. I live with chronic pain. I am always in some amount of pain somewhere in my body at all times. So I wasn't really sure how to answer those questions, and that didn't actually get easier after COVID because now I have long haul symptoms. They ask me if I have chest pain or shortness of breath, and I do, but they're not new, so I don't know how to answer. Something that bothered me through this whole process was how I felt like the questionnaires all targeted healthy people, and I didn't know, as someone with chronic illness, how to answer the questions. Just something that's worth pointing out. So then I called the ER at that hospital, and the woman I talked to who worked in the emergency department was super dismissive, and I kind of got the feeling that she thought that I was like a hypochondriac calling to get tested because I was worried. So that wasn't pleasant, and that's why I'm not naming this hospital, even though the first one was really nice. I'm sure that she just was getting a lot of people panicking and calling, but I did feel pretty annoyed about that. I have to stop here and say that if I didn't have as much experience with the medical world as I do, I might have stopped seeking help at this point. I might have been discouraged by this interaction alone because she was so dismissive and felt like maybe I was being silly, maybe I was overreacting, maybe it wasn't that serious. At this point, no one had done an exam or been able to listen to my lungs with a stethoscope, so it was really disappointing to be dismissed like that. Especially since even if I didn't have COVID, my symptoms were pretty concerning. Because I have that experience advocating for myself in these situations, I knew that I should keep seeking help until I got seen or until I got a better answer. But if I didn't have that experience, I don't know that I would have. I was still worried that the next person I talked to would think I was overreacting, or if I mentioned that I'd already talked to this other hospital, that they would think that I'm just seeking attention or overreacting, which thankfully did not happen. The next place I called was Tufts Medical Center, which I am naming because I had such a good experience with them, and I have had good experiences with them in the past. I did have to wait a while between calling the other hospital and calling them because my lungs were giving me so much trouble. My dad, who was extremely smart, told me to tell them about my history of pneumonia. I did, and they immediately told me that, especially because of that, I needed to come in and get tested and be checked out. Now, I found somewhere that will see me, and you'd think that would be the end of it, but no. Now we had to figure out how I was going to get there. The nurse in the emergency room asked if I could just walk there, but I could not do that because it was 3 miles away and I couldn't really breathe. So the next recommendation she gave was to take an Uber, but I was suspected of maybe having COVID, so I wasn't gonna put myself in an Uber with someone I didn't know and put them at risk for catching anything. So then I told them basically, I'm going to come in, I don't know how I'll get there, but I will get there. My dad called the city's COVID line. I literally just remember this. The reason we called the first hospital that we did was because my dad called the city of Boston's COVID line and was just like, hey, we tried to get seen at a urgent care and they're not seeing COVID patients. And the city of Boston said, like, they're supposed to be, and recommended that hospital. So my dad called that COVID line again and basically was like, okay, so we're gonna see doctors at this hospital. How do we get there? So what we settled on was me taking the T, which is the subway in Boston, which was obviously not the best choice because it does mean that I would be interacting with other people, but we decided that it was the safest option to put people at a lower risk than like getting into an enclosed space with one person and putting them at a higher risk. I had bought a cloth mask and put it in a suitcase in case I got sick while traveling so that I could be considerate to others and wear it on the plane. It was really hard to walk to the T and ride it to the hospital because of my lungs, but I did it. I got there. I was very careful to avoid being near other people. Luckily, no one was out really. If this looks slightly different than it did a second ago, it's because I had to take a break for my lungs, so I reset up and it might be a little bit different. So I got to the hospital, they checked me in, they triaged me by checking my vitals, and everything was normal except my temperature was a little bit higher than normal, and then I had to go sit and wait in like the waiting room where everybody was, which I thought was a little weird, but I just you know, like sat over in the corner, and it was fine. They took me back to a private room in the emergency department, and it was really surreal being in there because the window had frosted glass, so I could see the shadows of people walking by, but not like actually see them. And there was a sign on the door telling people to follow droplet protocol. So everyone who came in was in full PPE. The whole room smelled of just really strong cleaner. It was all bright white because it was a hospital, and it just felt like I was in like Contagion or another pandemic movie. I changed into a hospital gown and they got started. They did do a COVID test, of course, which back then was still when they would shove a really long Q-tip all the way up your nose. And I know they still do that, but it's not as common now. It was not a fun experience because it feels like they're gonna hit your brain. It hurts, and it made my nose bleed all the times that I got that test. Now, I recently went and did a drive-through test. Oh, so much easier, where you just stick a Q-tip up your nose slightly and then swirl it around. It made me sneeze, but I didn't bleed and it didn't hurt. So at least it's gotten better now. They did do a blood test, and I told the person who came in that blood tests really hurt for me, any kind of blood draw or needle, because of my fibromyalgia, which heightens my sensitivity to pain. And he said, no, it's not gonna hurt. And he just kind of did it, and it did hurt. And I think he could see the pain on my face because he then apologized for not listening to me. And it sucks, but that does happen sometimes. I did do an EKG, which I didn't remember until I looked back at the text I had with my dad because I brought one of the sensors home with me. I didn't remember it until now because now I remember how awkward it was for the guy putting the sensors on because he was like my age, so we made really awkward conversation while he did that. So that was fun. The other test that they did while I was there was a chest x-ray to see my lungs, to see if I had any fluid, which would be pneumonia or any other damage or concerning signs. They did bring the machine to me, which I thought was really cool because obviously they didn't want me, patient zero, walking around the hospital if I did have COVID. I remember that every time the woman who was doing it, the x-ray tech, touched anything around me, so when she put the board behind my back for the x-ray and when she took it away, she had to change her gloves before she could touch the machine again, which was really interesting. So she ended up changing her gloves like 3 times. And then as soon as she got outside of the room, she wiped the entire machine down. The blood test, the EKG, and the chest x-ray all came back clear and normal. So they basically told me that pending my result, it was probably just a really bad cold or flu if my result was negative. To drink lots of fluid, keep drinking tea, lie down, take Dayquil, do everything I had already been doing. So I went home. Getting there, I remember really vividly the struggle of walking to the T, getting on the T. I remember seeing an old man on the T and being like, stay away from him, he's high risk, you might have COVID. I don't really remember walking home. I think I was just so tired at that point that it's all just like a blur. And my COVID test came back negative, which I'm sure is pretty confusing to hear as I am talking about having had COVID. So I am actually a long hauler, as I mentioned earlier, as that's the next video I'll be making. And so after getting COVID and having lingering symptoms, I've gone to a lot of doctors and explained all of the symptoms I had in March and that I had a negative test result. All of my doctors have agreed that it was in fact COVID, that it was a false negative, it was not strong enough when I was tested, or the test was too early. Like I was given the test too early. I was tested in March of 2020 when the tests were not as reliable. Getting a false negative and then basically being confirmed that what I had was COVID has been really frustrating because I find that people don't believe you as much if you can't say, yes, I had a positive result, confirmed, had COVID. The other frustrating thing about getting a false negative is that when I was getting tested, like when I was in the ER, I emailed all my teachers to be like, hey, I'm getting tested for COVID and I'm in the hospital. I won't be doing my homework. I won't be coming to class. Everyone was really understanding. But I also emailed Berklee to tell them, hey, I might have COVID. Here's the last day I was on campus. Here's where I was when I was on campus. Here are my symptoms. Here's when I'll know. I told them I didn't have it because I got the negative result. And I just hope that that didn't mean that someone didn't get contacted who ended up being positive and they didn't infect other people or they themselves didn't get severely sick. I guess I'll just never know if that is the case, which is really frustrating and disappointing, but I did do the best that I could with the information I had at the time. So after the ER and after I got my test result back, my symptoms did not improve for the rest of the week. Luckily, they got good enough by the end of the week and the weekend that I was able to pack because my dad flew to Boston to drive me home to Chicago because I was so unwell that I kind of needed someone to take care of me because I couldn't really do much on my own. He flew to Boston very carefully, very safely, and drove me home in a minivan. Me, him, and a cat, 14 hours straight in a minivan. My symptoms eased. I was pretty okay. I was still really tired. My breathing wasn't completely back to normal, but I was definitely able to move around a lot more. Things were starting to seem like they were going back to normal, to the point where I had a small dance party in my room and I had what I know now is an asthma attack. And since that day, I've had trouble with my lungs. And that is the start of the second part of this story, which is my long haul journey. So that's actually where we're going to end today, and you'll have to come back to hear that story next week or the week after, depending on when I can film based on how my lungs are doing. If you want to know when it goes up, you can either subscribe to this channel, or if you want to check out my Instagram where I'm a lot more active, that would be the best way to do it because I will definitely post there, and that's a little bit more reliable than YouTube's algorithm. So there is that. If you have anything you want me to address in the long haul video, please leave it in the comments and hopefully I'll see them before that video. Or if you have any questions about what it was like to have COVID, what it was like to be diagnosed, what it's like to have COVID as a chronic illness human, please feel free to leave those in the description or the comments as well. In the meantime, I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy and sane in all of the craziness that is happening in this country. I live in America, so last week was a very eventful week, and I'll see you hopefully next week, depending on my lungs, but hopefully next week. Bye.